Hello, folks. Thanks for joining us this evening. My name is Nick, and I help direct events here at the Strand. Before we launch into tonight's event with Peter Guralnick and Elvis Costello, I'd like to share a little bit of history about the Strand. The Strand was founded in 1927 by Benjamin Bass on 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled from 48 bookstores until, after 93 years, the Strand is the sole survivor, now run by third generation owner Nancy Bass Wyden. We want to thank all of you for your support. Without our loyal community of book lovers, we would not be here today. Tonight, we are excited to have with us author and music critic Peter Guralnick. Peter's books include the prize winning 2-volume biography of Elvis Presley, Last Train to Memphis, and Careless Love, as well as Sweet Soul Music and Dream Boogie, The Triumph of Sam Cooke. He won a Grammy for his liner notes for Sam Cooke Live at the Harlem Square Club, wrote and co-produced the documentary Sam Phillips, The Man Who Invented Rock and Roll, and wrote the scripts for the Grammy-winning documentary Sam Cooke, Legend, and Martin Scorsese's blues documentary Feel Like Going Home. His most recent book is Looking to Get Lost: Adventures in Music and Writing. Joining Peter in conversation tonight is prolific musician Elvis Costello. Elvis began writing songs at the age of 13. 2017 marked the 40th anniversary of the release of his first record album, My Aim Is True. He is perhaps best known for the songs Allison, Pump It Up, Every Day I Write the Book, and his rendition of the Nick Lowe song, What's So Funny About Peace, Love, and Understanding. His record catalog consists of more than 30 albums, and he has performed worldwide with his bands The Attractions, his Confederates, which featured 2 members of Elvis Presley's TCB band, and his current group, The Imposters, as well as solo concerts and most recently, his acclaimed solo show, Detour. Elvis has countless further accolades not listed in tonight's intro, but without further ado, please join me in welcoming Peter Guralnick and Elvis Costello to the stage. And with that, I will excuse.
Hello there, how are you all? Peter, how are you? You can
I'm
hopefully.
doing fine. How are you doing?
I'm just doing great. Better for seeing you as ever. We're going to replicate something that you and I have done on many occasions, which is just talk about music. I would like, if you're at the risk of embarrassing you, may I just read a little introduction that wasn't covered in some of the things that were said just now by Nick?
Sure,
I,
no, but embarrass me away.
okay, ladies and gentlemen, as I'm sure many of you know, Charlie Rich once wrote a beautiful song called Feel Like Going Home. It's an extraordinary yearning ballad, and what is more remarkable is it was composed in response to a portrait of the singer written by Peter Guralnick. It comes from an essay, a collection of essays of the same name. It is more common for music to inspire prose of various shades of purple, but this was a description of a man with conflicts at a moment after his greatest commercial success had left him, nonetheless, with crippling self doubt and a tendency to self destruct. Peter Guralnick's portrait moved Charlie Rich in its honesty and humility, that he in turn was moved to render this lovely, heartfelt song of longing. I can think of no finer compliment to the writer on the subject of music and humanity to have inspired the song in this way. For myself, having been kept from any such secrets, other than what could glean from the grooves, by the accident of being born in England, I have these young years been so grateful to Peter for his writing, and for all of which I've come to understand and feel ever more deeply about some of the greatest artists in American music. It's my honor to join you tonight, Peter, celebrating the publication of this collection, Looking to Get Lost. And after that formality, shall we just tell me, this is a collection which if I may say, puts you as a writer it's as much a story about writing as it is a story about the people who you're writing about. It's about the creative impulse as well as the result of that creativity, the product of that creativity. Would you agree with that?
Well, yeah, no, I think what for me, what sets the book apart, and in many ways it's similar, let's say, to Lost Highway, my second book of profiles, but the through line is the personal story. And while I didn't want to intrude on the stories of people like Charlie Rich, or in this case, Ray Charles, Merle Haggard, Dick Curless, Solomon Burke, Doc Pomus, at the same time, the experiences that I had were so inspiring. They were so encapsulated, or they just brought me something which I could never have had otherwise. And it was the reason I called the book My Adventures, or uh, Adventures in Music and Writing, is because although they were basically revolved around the adventures of the people I was writing about, they also revolved around my adventures and my commitment to pursuing these subjects, not just to their own portraiture, but also to levels of experience that I think I never otherwise would have had.
You're very funny about yourself in this book. You're very truthful in your nature since I've known you these years, to be self-effacing against, in the face of like huge scholarship about these subjects, and to say that you teach and you have command of language that many other writers who pontificate about music simply don't have access to. It was curious though to read you speaking of the way you had to review the way you wrote about the way you approached Skip James. You were a young man, you had ideas about who he was, who he might be, and then you confront the reality. And again, with Howling Wolf, you had the experience of actually having somebody read a preview of one of his shows, and you're speaking in these very beautiful but clearly not the work of a man who'd ever met the subject. So I can't try and summon that up for the people joining us today. What must it be like to be sitting there and have somebody read your writing to Howling Wolf while he's sitting there?
Well, I was just so mortified. But in many ways, I don't think I would have used that anecdote had it not led to something else. And so, when I wrote something like "The Wolf Doesn't Jive," and as this was being read aloud, and even years later, I think, oh God, how could I ever have written that? But Wolf took it all in, and he was very appreciative. He would say, "Where'd you get that from, boy?" And it would be in response to my quoting from his lyrics. And I took that all as well. Anyway, I was shivering in my boots. But then he went on stage, and he basically acted out every single element of my description of his performance. And at one point, he got up off the floor, stood there towering, because he was a very big man and it was a very low ceiling at the Club 47. And he shook his finger at the audience and he says, "The wolf don't jive. His friends know that." So I felt, well, gee, I really hit on something there.
What could be? That's the best review you ever had, Peter. I mean,
Yeah, no, it couldn't have been better. But in some ways, one of the reasons I've never left the people I wrote about at the start, and you know this as well as anybody. I mean, the first person I wrote about, or one of the first people I wrote about in For Feel Like Going Home, was Muddy Waters. That was 1970 when I first interviewed him. But I'm no less interested in Muddy Waters today than I was then. And there are two chapters in the book. One is on Wolf, which you mentioned, and one is on Jerry Lee Lewis. And I felt compelled to go back, not to set the record straight, because when I had originally written about them, I mean, I'm not disowning that in any way, but I wrote about them in the terms that meant the most and that I best understood at that time. And as my interest in them and my knowledge deepened, and as my frame of reference deepened, I wanted to go back and do a different kind of portrait, maybe a more freewheeling kind of a portrait. And that's what these are.
yeah, that is something I noticed in both in reading this book, and also, of course, it made me go back and reread, particularly the subjects that you had written about in Feel Like Going Home.
Mhm.
I noticed, I mean, you may not have been correcting yourself, but you are quite, some of the strongest language that you reserve the scorn for people who misrepresented Skip James. I mean, you're quite critical in the chapter about Skip James about a book that perceived him in certain ways that you thought were inaccurate. I was very pleased to see that, because you've had the benefit of thinking about these things over a long period of time. And if you're prepared to say, well, we all have these romantic ideas about musicians, as I said in my introduction, I learned things from records. I had no chance to see
Mhm.
the people I most admired. When I first read Feel Like Going Home and then Lost Highway, it was to open up a book literally on the character of these people. And as I said, also, not always in their most glorious moment, with all of their contradictions, with their impulse to auto-destruct at key points in their career. That's a sort of running theme in quite a few of the people here, who are great nonetheless, and are almost celebrated for their inability to do what's predicted of them. That would be Jerry Lee, that would be Solomon Burke. Sam Phillips, I think, we went looking for people who had that quality. But you have also in this collection a strange perspective. It must feel different to you that you are the author of the most authoritative and most heartfelt biographies of Elvis Presley. And we've spoken about them before. You've mentioned incidents in them that anybody else, you've told me stories that you told me you left out because you
Right.
absolutely qualify. And you know the story I'm talking about. So I know the integrity that you brought to that book. It is one of the chapters that I found most moving in this collection is the portrait of Colonel Tom Parker, who
Mhm.
is so often cast as the villain. And I one of the things that it's important. I think it would be incorrect for you not to locate yourself as having written these biographies in Colonel Tom's lifetime. So you had correspondence with him and moved towards even possibly him talking about he would maybe
Right.
give you the his story. You know this. What was that correspondence like?
Well, that's one of the many new chapters in the book. And I guess I came back to it because I had certainly portrayed him, particularly in Careless Love, the second volume of the Elvis. But I feel like he is so misunderstood in history. And having had the opportunity to meet him and having had this correspondence with him to begin with, and then I met him, then we engaged in this round of correspondence. And people always talk about, I don't know, fifth dimension chess or, so many dimension chess. It was like with the Colonel, the wonderful thing about corresponding with him was he was so alert, he was so sharp, he was so on top of things, and he so enjoyed the game, as Solomon Burke did. I mean, very much, very similar in lots of ways. And yet there was an openness and a kindness to him in this exchange that no matter how many times he trumped me, no matter how many times he said, I feel sorry for you writing this account. It's completely wrong. And I would say, well, Colonel, that's why I'm sending it to you, because you alone could correct it. And he would never be trapped by that. He would say, no, you really have missed the point here. I think you shouldn't write about it at all. And then he would always end up after excoriating me, but I am still your friend, Colonel. And underneath it was, it was typed, the Colonel. But one of the basic things that's misunderstood is that when Elvis first joined him, and never forget that when after Colonel sold Elvis the contract to RCA, Elvis sent him a telegram saying, "You were like a father to me. I love you like a father." And he did. He really did. But Colonel was the star. Elvis was not the star. Colonel Parker had had success beyond anything that anyone had ever seen in country music, with Eddie Arnold in particular, then with Hank Snow. And Elvis would have done anything to get signed by the Colonel. And the Colonel it was not as if Elvis was it was just a cinch to make it. Colonel saw the talent. He also tried to guide it. And there are letters which he wrote to Elvis in which he said, you can't behave like that on stage. If you want me to represent you, you have to perform in a way.
The fatherly way, the
Yes.
concern, because there are tapes of Elvis mumbling and saying things under his breath that might be swearing, and they were probably very mild-mannered by modern standards of misbehavior. But we are living in a very different time. And of course, we have the benefit of seeing the accumulated fame of Elvis Presley and the myth making that's gone around him, and people editorializing what actually happened. I mean, you point out that John Lennon was quoted as saying he never was the same after the army, but you point out that the records he made immediately after being in the army were actually really good records. They were among his very finest records.
They're amazing records. The ballads that he sang in 60, 61, 62, I would defy anyone to listen to them with unprejudiced ears and not recognize his commitment to the songs, his commitment in a sense to interpreting the songs in a way that I think he had never imagined before.
Colonel Tom is seen in your account as somebody who has a sense of what he himself had been through, even if he wasn't always entirely truthful or wasn't full disclosure about who he was, where he'd been, what he may have done, and some of it is myth making. But I know you didn't want to do a reading as such, but can I prevail on you to just, because one thing really touched me in this, it's a short letter that the Colonel wrote to some businessmen who had come to strike a deal with him for $80,000 of merchandising. And you tell the story that at the moment that these businessmen came, and 80,000 in 65 is, I can't even imagine what that is but that's a lot of money. And a businessman who was a friend of the Colonel's arrived at the same time, who was a guy
not even a businessman, a balloon salesman.
Well, I mean, he was looking to make a deal with the Colonel over this these novelty items, which of course, when you think about it, surely would have been the stuff of the merchandising deal. But the Colonel took the time he kept them waiting. He kept these people with $80,000 worth of merchandising deal waiting while he listened. And the thing that I think is most curious about it is that you said he kept this friend of his with the $40 worth of balloons in the office for an hour, negotiating with him until he settled on a price of $38 to spare the man's pride.
Right.
When they took issue, when the businessmen came in and took issue with the Colonel keeping them waiting, he said he had decided not to do the deal with them at all. His loyalty, and it's a curious kind of loyalty, isn't it? It's like he values that guy's pride more than he did the $80,000.
Right, and he said the money that he was paying him, and this was a pal from his carnival days, I believe. The money that he was paying him, which was just a pittance, meant more to that man than the $80,000 would mean to either him or to the other men he was doing business with. And he had a real sense of honor. And I'm not trying to, paint him as a saint or anything, but I feel like I got to know him fairly well. One of the great things was that after telling me he just couldn't give me any information. He had turned too many people down. He wasn't a dirt farmer. That was the line he always came back to. I'm not a dirt farmer, because he assumed that information was always bad information that gave gave dirt about the other person. But he always would come back and offer me something, which he would offer me a hint. He would offer me, he would suggest where I should go. I mean, the best thing of all was right after I met him, he invited me to his 80th birthday party at the International Hotel, or at the Hilton Hotel in Las Vegas. And at the end of the evening, I went up to him. He and Sam Phillips were arguing vociferously over not just the day by day part of their negotiations to sell Elvis's contract, but over the hour by hour and sometimes minute by minute. And they were each in full possession of all their mental acuity, all their mental faculties. And I'm standing there listening to them, and I had to leave. And I'm thinking, God, and Sam says, "Oh, you got to come back tomorrow morning. We can revisit this." And I'm thinking, oh God, I got to leave. But I introduced myself to Colonel. And I said, "I'm Peter Guralnick, and thanks so much for inviting me to your party. And he just nods his head and he says, I put you on the list. And I think, well, he didn't understand what I was saying. And, so I said, no, I mean, I really appreciate you. And he says, I put you on the list. The third time he said, I put you on the list. I realized he was telling me he put me on the list. He put me in touch with all these people whom otherwise I would have had almost no chance of meeting, all these people within the intimate confines of Elvis's world. And then it was up to me. And then the follow-up to the party, I wrote to all of them. I got in touch with them. I said, I met you briefly at the party. I would never have brought up the book at the party. And most of them spoke to me and never would have, but they spoke to me because Colonel put me on the list and he knew exactly what he was saying.
It's almost like a mystery writer, isn't he, in a way, the way he's leaving these clues. I mean, he feels like he would be played in the movie of his life by Orson Welles.
Right, very much, yeah, no, that would have been a great person to play him.
Because of the ability, the sleight of hand aspect. When I looked at the list and I was trying to make notes of places that we might talk about, we obviously can't talk about every chapter. It was really thanks to you in many ways that I can say what I'm about to say. I think of the chapters I either have seen in person because I had the curiosity, or in some cases got to know 21 of the subjects in this book. Some of them I worked with and some of them only for one. But of course, the one that we have discussed over a supper before now, and the one who you have such a loving and sometimes exasperated portrait of, is Solomon Burke. Mm-hmm. We've shared a couple of evenings with Solomon that are, well, the one in particular that you mentioned in Cleveland is one of the more extraordinary experiences I've ever had on stage. But you tell everybody in shorthand, because you will really, anybody reading this chapter about Solomon will see an encapsulation of his character as manifest in his friendship with you. Can you tell people briefly how you came to know him and how this developed?
Well, again, this is a chapter that had never appeared before, although I've written about Solomon Burke in the past. But I met Solomon when I began Sweet Soul Music, and I went to desperate lengths to try to connect with him. And finally found, through Sam Cooke's business partner, J.W. Alexander, contacted a lawyer who was purported to be Solomon's lawyer. And I had no more luck with him than anything else. And then one day, I left the house. I was going out of the house to the driveway, and Alexandra, my wife, comes running out and says, there's a man on the phone who says he's Solomon Burke or represents Solomon Burke or has something to do with. And I came back in. And he said, well, now how exactly do you pronounce your name? So I told him, and he said, Guralnick. That's the only time he ever pronounced it correctly. After that, it was just, what the hell or high water. But he sounded, let's say he sounded like an insurance salesman. And I'm thinking, what does he have to do with Solomon Burke? When finally I told him that I was writing a book about Southern soul music, gospel influence, his tone and his voice totally changed. And he said, oh, of course, well, I can't do justice to his voice. He said, of course. How could you do a book about soul music without speaking to the king? And that was, we were off and running. I mean, I went to see him at Tramps in New York, maybe 2 weeks later. I was all over the country, all over the world with him at various times over the next, 25 years or so. But it was the most astonishing journey because he just was one of the brightest, as you well know, one of the funniest and one of the absolute funniest, but also one of the most deepest feeling people that I've ever met. But it wasn't a relationship that was without conflict. I mean, there was no overt conflict, but he tended to like to create situations, and they were sometimes situations in which one might not want to be involved. And I had to make that clear, and I did. And, at one point he said, I told him, look, Solomon, I love you, but I don't play. And Solomon, there's a pause at the other end of the line, and Solomon says, that's what I love about you, Pete. You always take the long view. But the last 3 times that last 3 times that I saw Solomon, he burst into tears each time. This is only part of the chapter because the chapter is a triptych, and there are 3 different um, parts to it. One of which is a monologue by Solomon about how he entered show business, how he was signed by Apollo Records when he was 18 or 19 years old. But the thing is that it was such an amazing trip, and his emotional depths, as funny as he was, and the last 3 times I saw him, each time he burst into tears. And the last time was when we were talking. I'd given him my book on Sam Cooke, and he said, "Pete, it's a great book." I mean, I don't know how many, let's say he read all of it, or let's say he read some of it. It doesn't matter. He says, "It's a great book." He says, "But when are we going to write the book?" And the book, of course, was the book about him. And I would have given anything to do it. But I kept trying to get Solomon to put down on, to put on tape some beginnings to it, so we would have something to work with and there would be some commitment. And the last time I think that we were talking, I suggested to him that he talk to his daughter, Victoria, about when he was the Wonder Boy preacher, 7, 8, 9. And he looked at me and he said, "How about when I was 10? And I said, "Well, okay, you could cover that too." I said, "Why? What happened when you were 10? He says, "That's when they put me out in the street." And I said, "Oh, well, who put you out in the street?" And he just looks at me and he says, "That's what that's what I could never figure out." And I said, "Well, why did they put you out in the street?" And he says, "I never did find out." And he just burst into tears. And I mean, it was just, I don't know what that had to do. I mean, I do know something of what that had to do with it, but it just was so astonishing. And because with Solomon, you could be playing out these elaborate jokes sometimes. You could be sitting with him in this broken down motel, and he could be calling somebody up and, and describing the steak dinner he was having at the Ritz. This was really sometimes trying to evade debt collectors, and he would say, "Well, let me get I'm going to have my controller, Mr. Stein." He was Mr. Stein too. "I'm going to have my controller call you back." But the main thing was that he was staying in luxury in a presidential suite at the Ritz or something. And I'm sitting there across from him and, with this hamburger and French fries, but I could taste the steak. You could always taste the steak as he described it.
He could absolutely do that then. And in the chapter, you without spoiling it, that monologue is really beautiful. And then you fact check it. And of course, although some of it is creation, it's like an improvisation upon his own life, because the essential details are accurate, but they're embellished in this marvelous way. That evening.
And the other thing, Elvis, is the central emotional details.
Yeah, that's what's
all absolutely true. Yeah. And yet he creates, I mean, he could have written a great novel. He wrote a great novel every day of his life, but yes, you're right. You're absolutely right.
I mean, that evening that you describe, which, as far as I know, was the first time that Solomon and Aretha had ever sung together. That show in Cleveland.
I believe so. Yeah.
That was celebrating the release of your book, Dream Boogie, and everybody was singing, and I found myself in this impossible situation of singing on the bill between Solomon Burke and Aretha. And if you recall, Solomon didn't really sing during his set. He handed the microphone and basically preached. He didn't really take a show-stopping lead, because I guess it had always been set up that he would close the show. And equally, as you describe, Aretha sang 3 relatively obscure Sam Cooke songs when everybody expected her to sing "Change Is Gonna Come," or one of the other big numbers that hadn't been heard throughout the evening. I don't know where were you when Aretha took the stage? Were you in the house or were you side stage?
I think I was backstage, because I came out. See, Solomon was closing the show with "A Change Is Going to Come," which ended up being everybody singing, as you say. But it started out with Solomon. And he's sitting there on his throne, and he is singing it beautifully. And all of a sudden, this voice comes from backstage, from the wings, and it's Aretha. And I wasn't standing on that side. If I was, backstage, I wasn't standing beside her. And then all of a sudden she emerges. She walks out across the thing. And Solomon was just overcome. I mean, Solomon was not a shrinking violet by any means.
Well,
And
let me tell you, here is something that I read it, and you described that she came into the wing, out of the wings, regally, as one would expect the Queen of Soul. But here is the perspective that I can lend to your account.
Mhm.
I was actually standing at the head of the line of guest singers who were supposed to join Solomon in the final chorus. And because myself and Otis Clay were the only people in evening dress, they had put us at the front of the line. Everybody was in a complete mixture of clothes. Said, you guys look business-like. You lead the procession out. Just as we went to do that, somebody's hand grabbed our shoulders and pulled us into the wings. And I glanced to see who it was to my right. And I saw Aretha moving at considerable speed from, I guess, her dressing room,
Mhm.
like faster than you would think Aretha could move.
And you remember the elaborate gown she was wearing.
Until she got right to the level with where she would become visible and stopped dead and then proceeded regally. So she had obviously heard the song start from the speaker in her dressing room and made that entrance. It was one of the most, she left her shoes behind, if you recall. She wasn't wearing her shoes when she entered.
Yeah.
And Solomon, as you describe elsewhere in the book, he started to preach behind, they traded.
Right.
And my memory of it is that by the end of it, Solomon was crying and saying, bring the boys home, which had, I guess, some relationship to the soldiers overseas. I have no idea. But exactly in that moment, there was a whole other drama going on while he and Aretha, like, we're all standing at the back trying to stay out of trouble with a few microphones swaying along. Who's going to try and get in the way of this? It was one of the most incredible experiences.
It was just amazing. And he was utterly overcome. And then I went up to him. He was still sitting there on his throne, which was a great big chair that was decorated like a throne. Which was part of his contract for all of his shows. And I went up to him and he just, tears were just coursing down his cheeks. He said, did you see that, Pete? Did you see that? She came out, we did this. And then in Solomon's typical way, I don't mean that he spun it out at that time. He was just genuinely overcome with emotion. But he then spun out the idea they would go on a world tour. They would, play for the Pope, whom I think he did play for actually. And then he came up with the idea, and this was really one of the funniest parts of it. He got the idea that he would use Steve Bing's airplane. And Steve was a great friend. I had introduced Steve to Solomon, and he was a wonderful friend to Solomon. And Solomon called him up. Steve called me up within 30 seconds, I think, with a phone call concluding, because Solomon had proposed to Steve that if they could use Steve's plane, which was the plane that took President Clinton to North Korea to bring back those 2 women hostages, if they could use Steve's plane, Aretha would overcome her fear of flying, and they would have this tour of Europe, which such as nobody had ever seen before, to coin a phrase. And so Steve knew Solomon. He knew Solomon by his own perceptions, and he knew Solomon through me. And at the end of this, Solomon's pitch, he then says, that sounds like a wonderful idea, Solomon. All you'll have to do is pay for the fuel, which was the end of the idea. But he called me up, and he was just so tickled with it. And for all I know, he would have financed it. I mean, Steve would do he would do anything for Jerry Lee. He would do anything for Solomon. But it was such a wonderful extension of that moment on stage at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
I think we'd probably both agree that things of that nature are better because it wasn't televised. It probably never would have happened quite that way if it had been televised. I assume there must be some archive footage of it, but it wasn't on television. This isn't the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame ceremony. This was a tribute concert to Sam Cooke in which everybody sang Sam Cooke songs. And I mean, it was an extraordinary thing to witness. And backstage after the show, I remember Solomon saying that he wanted to go and say goodnight to Aretha. And we waited, the 2 of us, outside her dressing room for a few minutes. And eventually Aretha came to the door and they said a few words. I stepped back and let them have a conversation. He said goodnight. And then I went to pay my respects to Aretha, and she took an instamatic picture of me from like 6 inches away, like without asking me, just like saw me and just, and suddenly I couldn't see anything but stars. It was so incredible, you know. It was, it was. I think the next day I was flying wherever I was going home to, and I literally couldn't believe it had happened. The whole thing seemed like a dream. That somehow I feel you have some part in making, because my understanding of these people, Solomon called me out of the blue not very long before he passed, and just because he had recorded this one song of mine, and he just called me to ask me how his nephews were, who were my sons. You know, a very similar thing. It was so strange just to get a call from him, and I felt if you hadn't given me a sense in your writing, I wouldn't have known how to introduce myself to some people. I wouldn't have known what to expect. That the thing about the portraits is that you consistently show the resilience of people to adversity. And some people who are like Delbert McClinton, who is just an extraordinary musician to this day. I saw him recently in Nashville. I mean, his voice is just so great.
Yeah, isn't he terrific?
His last record was just such a great record. He wrote all the songs, arranged it. And I just feel that people, you know, from living over in England, you know, hear these things in whispers from magazines. People like yourself would write about people that we could only know about from records. You have had the experience because there's a vibrant musical scene where you have lived most of your life. That people came. There's a college there. The people were interested in folk music. They were interested in blues. People made sure that Skip James had an audience. I mean, that he came and had an audience. Um, but you also mention the the other side of the repetitive nature of touring, which is the, you know, the perfunctory performance. We go and see somebody we've longed to see, and it's another night at work for them. It's like if you do a work, you know, a 9 to 5 job, 5 days a week job, you don't go to work utterly inspired every day. Some days you are, some days it's just hours you're at work. Musicians can be like that too. You paint a portrait of that. As some of these people, the the essay about Wolf mentions he sort of responded to your prompting to bring everything that is entire, you know, I suppose you could say it's the box of tricks, you know, the things that he's done. He could summon up those things. You could
Yeah, it's
summon
practically bringing the temple down around your head. I mean, with Wolf, these were very powerful tricks.
I remember
You know, it's somebody like Merle Haggard
yeah,
wrote a song called Footlights, which is the focal point of the portrait of him in the book. And it's just one of the bleakest portraits of his, you know, and all through my conversation with him at that time. And I had met him a number of times over the years, and he always had an interest in an original point of view. But the focal point of this conversation was just he was done with this. He was tired of it. I don't think that was in fact true, but that was his mood of the moment. And people expected things of you and it was just the footlights was, you know, just looking out over the footlights at the audience and what was being expected of him and why should he go on with this. He'd rather play, you know, guitar in a band or just write his songs or something. But that, if somebody like Solomon, I don't know that that's true. And even somebody like Dick Curless, who had a career over, uh, 40 years uh, in not in obscurity, but in relative obscurity compared with, let's say, Ray Charles, and he found such a regenerative um, spirit in performing. He brought such warmth to the songs that he sang, to the ways in which he connected with his audience. So in some ways, it could represent a kind of spiritual connection that didn't otherwise, because someone like Jerry Lee Lewis just invented himself over and over again, night after night after night, singing songs differently each and every night, the same songs, you know, that never singing a song the same way twice.
I think I've told you this before, but in the years that I lived in Ireland, briefly, Jerry Lee was I won't say a neighbor, but he lived in the next town to me. he lived in Ireland for a year or something, and he turned up one day on an afternoon game show. It was like a name that tune sort of, where people would have to play and you would have to, and and Jerry Lee, as you won't be surprised to find, could not grasp the rules of this game whatsoever. I mean, it was an absolute, you know, it would be like an observation that you made from numerous experiences with him. But it was all the more surreal because it was happening on afternoon Irish television. And whenever they gave him the cue, and so what's the answer to that, Jerry Lee? He would just start playing Over the Rainbow or something with lots came in every so often, as he tended to do, you know, and it was absolutely, I suppose, because he was removed from his environment, it was all the more obvious that that was the way he was wired. What about the self-destruct aspect of some of these people? I mean, you wrote about Charlie Rich, as I mentioned, in that period where he had huge success, but he did wrestle a lot. And Merle, I remember seeing him open for Bob Dylan, and I mean, he sort of grouched all the way through the set about how Bob had not spoken to him on the tour. I don't know why, because I would imagine he hugely admired him, but he sort of was, and I almost felt like he was playing the role of somebody disgruntled. There was a little bit of role playing going on, but musically, he was, for a short set, he was just unbelievable.
Mm-hmm.
What about the that auto destruct thing that's in some people, that when it gets a little too close to orderly, they have to press the red button? Do you know any of these people well enough to feel don't do that, or do you just have to watch it?
No, I mean, I think that the anarchic impulse frequently takes over. I mean, particularly with someone like Jerry Lee, who, it doesn't have to be a game. The rules were not written for Jerry Lee, no matter what, framework he may be operating in. And the same with Solomon. I mean, he was going to do what he did. I mean, a friend of mine, Sleepy LaBeef, a wonderful artist, um, and somebody who achieved a good deal of success, but could have achieved a good deal more had he been willing to harness his talents in a way that was more marketable. Had he been willing to do a set list, to put together a band that was more conventionally talented. The thing about Sleepy, he was always looking, as so many people are, he was always looking for the unusual sound. So he might meet you, and you would tell him, I play guitar. And he would say, well, why don't you, join us? I think you could bring something to the band. On the first night, he would put you on piano. Now, you might never have played keyboards in your life, and you might be thoroughly embarrassed. But for Sleepy, he would be hearing a unique sound coming from you as you struggled for. And the funny thing is that someone like Sleepy, Merle Haggard did no less self-destructive things, but Merle Haggard always emerged from whatever problems he had because of just the illimitable elements of his talent. I mean, it just was he was like the Sam Cooke of his generation, in the sense that he was a songwriter of unparalleled skills and ambition. He was a singer with the same skills. And there are so few people like that, so few artists who combine that and then produced himself, as Sam did. But Merle could do all the things that many others did, and that you could explain, and those moments where he failed to take advantage of an opportunity, they never really added up for him. So I don't really know. I mean, it's just one of the, I spent the last 2 or 3 years writing this chapter on Dick Curless, which is like a nonfiction novella, a country singer from Maine who was as, big-hearted, as sincere, as great in his talents as anybody, but who never made it in quite that way. And you just saw, telling the story surprised me so many times as I told it, because I thought it would just be a story, even though I knew the story, and yet in telling it, I recognized that there were so many moments where things could have gone the other way, and they didn't. And they created a kind of a sequence of events in his life, or repetitiveness of events, that he was determined to talk about. He, like so many of the people I've written about, and I admire this so much, he was not interested in the fairy tale version of the story, the white picket fence, I mean, and the, the roses around it. He would have been offended if you tried to tell the story in that way. And so even though he was born again, even though he embraced his newfound or his, regained religion in a way that really was the most important thing in some ways in his life, but the truth, these stories of living and learning and treating the truth honestly and decently and without fear and without seeing it as something that took away from from good intentions or all the aspirations you had. That was a story that I was, that I was given to tell by him.
This is a beautiful thing in the perspective of a writer who can capture these things, because so much writing about music is creating a hierarchy of things. This is compared to this, this leads to this.
Mm-hmm.
The portraits that you've created of people are often, like as you mentioned at the beginning, it's about creativity. Not all of the people you're writing about have a great int- intellectualized sense of themselves as artists. They are artists as we observe them rather than the way they carry themselves. I think Skip James is the perfect example. Is that who is to say whether he even had a frame of reference for exactly how extraordinary he is? And Robert Johnson, we also have a version of Robert Johnson that's the recorded record that you know that scholarship and investigation has discovered that he played many other kinds of music that were just never captured on record. We have a very different view of Robert Johnson. If he had recorded a bunch of songs that sounded like the Mississippi Sheiks, we might love them really well, but they would have had a different character had they not all been at this edge.
If he had recorded Mexicali Rose, let's say.
Exactly, the desperation that we read into it. And there's a curious, almost bookending, something which, as somebody coming from England and finding my way into the music through listening to records, through finding the clues. Oh, that songwriter wrote this, and now they wrote on this record, and then you'd find a few facts out about those people, and then through your books and a very few others that had the same sense of humanity, you actually got to feel as if you knew some of the people. You write about Robert Johnson at the beginning of the book, and then there's an extraordinary interview with Eric Clapton, who I will put my hand up to say is someone whose playing has never moved me. The people, I admire him tremendously. He's clearly a really wonderful musician, but in terms of sort of people from the Blues Breakers, I'm a Peter Green man, and that will always be the way it is. But when reading about his friendship with Buddy Guy, and the way he spoke about, with the respect about, I can't even touch that song, was
Right.
I hadn't ever encountered in that. I just had, it educated me, because I didn't particularly like psychedelic music, so I was not drawn towards Cream. So I liked all the most concise things Eric Clapton ever played, and it was really shocking to me, the soulfulness of the way he spoke about these things, even though he's speaking as somebody who can fill the Albert Hall for 10 nights. He's not playing juke joints. He's a massively successful rock musician.
Well, one of the interesting things was how almost yearningly he speaks of the freedom
Yes.
with which somebody like Buddy Guy plays, with which Robert Johnson played, the self-confidence and the way in which somebody like Muddy Waters carried himself, the command that he had. And a few of the questions I asked him had to do with, well, all right, so why don't you set all this aside for a moment? Don't abandon, your stardom, don't abandon the big shows, but set it aside and give yourself over to playing in the way that Buddy Guy does. And he had some thoughts. Well, maybe I can do that at the Victorian Albert, or what is it, the Albert Hall, yeah. And but he, but basically, he found reasons that he couldn't do it do what his idols did, couldn't let himself go in that way. And I'm not faulting himself for that, but it was very much a part of his concept of his playing, what he owed. And for example, if he was playing at a big concert where you had all these pre-programmed parts, on keyboards or and he couldn't cross up the players.
Mhm.
And so it was a funny kind of contradiction or conundrum or something. And you felt like he just was yearning in some ways to escape.
Well, another thing that was in that interview is something that there is this otherness that he expresses with regard to how you actually ask him the question, how did you first meet the blues? I think they're the words. And it does seem to have touched a nerve in a number of people who have no reason to identify with this music because their life, the reality of their life, if it's English working class, which it is in his case, is certainly in no way comparable to Charlie Patton or.
Well, but me too, like me too.
But there is something spiritually that is completely authentic in that response. And it's something that I think I mentioned to you that, it is remarkable to me that that I find myself one of the two people in one of the chapters in your book. That's something I could never have dreamed of, Peter. I thank you for that, because it is a chapter about my collaboration with Alan Toussaint. There's also my brother, T-Bone Burnett. There's a wonderful essay about his collaboration with Willie Dixon, and something that in some ways the two English guys and T-Bone have is there's this little detachment from the impulses that make all of those people that we were working with who they are. There's something, no matter how much we surrender to it, there is this barrier to getting there. It's not a black white thing or any such tedious cliche. It's purely, I believe it's purely because I should be singing songs about jolly plowboys or something, from English history or maybe further back into Irish history. But that music never spoke to me. But country music does, particularly the music that I think of in the crossroads, not the Robert Johnson crossroads, but the crossroads between country and R&B
Mhm.
and pen music, as I think of it,
Yeah, yeah.
So, and you repeatedly in these essays come to the point of these visionary people, whether they're Sam Phillips or in a more modest way, the people that ran Malco Records
Mhm.
or even Lieber and Stoller, who are immersed in African American culture to the point of they believe themselves in with that. Of course, they can leave those prohibitions, those that the realities of segregation in those
But look at someone like Doc.
somebody that they worked with who was Greek and yet lived in the African American
Well,
community.
that's yeah. But then
You know,
look at someone like Doc Pomus, for example, who by a stroke of fate is afflicted with polio at the age of, I forget how old, 7 or 8. And that's what he lives with for the rest of his life. And his ambition is to be a blues singer from the time he first hears Big Joe Turner, at whatever age it was. And his story is so remarkable, again, in terms of its outreach. I mean, I feel like there's so much generosity of spirit and so much aspiration, artistic aspiration among almost all the people that I'm writing about. And it's not a question of being conscious or unconscious. It's something which is they're almost driven to express, which I believe applies to you as well. But the point is, it was someone like Doc. What's so astonishing about his story is there he starts out. He's in this, joint down in the village. They tell him, you got to spend some bucks if you're going to stay here. And he says, no, I'm a blues singer. I'm a singer. I'm a blues singer. And they put him up on stage and he sings the only song he knows, which is a Big Joe Turner song, any key, it doesn't matter. But then he continues and he writes songs for Elvis Presley. He writes songs like, say, The Last Dance for Me. I mean, songs which have gone down. But he continues to write right up until his dying breath. I mean, he's in the hospital. Yeah, he's 65 years old. I think it was 1990, maybe 1991. And he's in the hospital and he's writing with Mac Rebenak, with Dr. John. He's working on songs that are going to be going on to a Johnny Adams Sings Doc Pomus album. And his but his style continued to evolve over the years. It was how many people, yeah, and there are people, but he winnowed down his style. I mean, he became more eloquent as he looked to say less explicitly. And it's an astonishing story, and both his wisdom and his humanity and his vulnerability too are something that just I found so captivating, and just he was such a wonderful guy, and it was such a good friendship.
It's something that I'm so glad that you mentioned, because your account is very rich of Doc. But you mentioned also the film, which of course shows it, and he talks about the circumstances in which he wrote "Save the Last Dance," which are very heartrending. When I was a kid, you know, Andy Williams was on the radio singing "Can't Get Loose to You, Can't Get Used to Losing You," which is a heartrending song. Another one like that. The fact that it could be a pop record, they had that ability to reach across. As I said, I looked through the list of people. I thought, I've actually met some of these people. A few of them I've worked with, as we said. But I mean, I remember in 1978, and it's something that your account of Doc really put in a context for me. I had sat in with Delbert McClinton in a club in Dallas sometime in 1978, and I was traveling back through New York, and saw he was playing at the Lone Star. So I went to see him, and of course, the word got out. I was in the house, and somebody said, "Delbert says, do you want to come up and sing again with me?" Except the guy that's up there before me is Otis Blackwell. Otis Blackwell is singing with Delbert, and they proceed to do, needless to say, a couple of Elvis Presley tunes. You know, so it seems now like it's a gag and now we have Elvis coming up. And when I get back to my seat, there is Doc Pomus sitting at the neck. And I thought all of this was like one magic night in New York. Little did I know until I read your account that, of course, Doc was in that club. I won't say every night, but he was frequently at the Lone Star.
Many nights, yeah.
That was kind of his hang. And it all seemed, I went home with this, couldn't believe it had happened, because I got to sing with Delbert again, which was great. And I have to follow the band that wrote these Elvis Presley songs. And there's Doc Pomus. It was as if I had walked into one of those paintings of Rock Dreams. You know, I don't know who that guy was that painted those fanciful drawings
Yeah,
of
the Nick Cohen book. Yeah.
together. You know, it felt like that at 24. But you're it's no surprise when you look at the people that are gathered together. There are people that really deeply value this, and I'm grateful to. Like Mac Rabenak is somebody who, for somebody growing up in Liverpool and London, there is no way for me to have made the connections between the pop records that came onto the radio, things that were in the pop charts, and the depth of the music that was on, say, Gumbo by Dr. John, which was a summary for everybody else in the world of 25 years of New Orleans music.
Right, right.
And of course,
Gentlemen,
that is something that I got to experience even more in working with Alan Toussaint. You know, the circumstances which brought Alan to New York were unthinkable. But his
Right.
and stoicism is something, I would say the same thing about Alan, who's a very different person to Doc Pomus from what I gather from your portrait in the brief time I met him myself. But Alan's grace, generosity to everybody he worked with was something I'll never ever forget.
And don't forget the song that he would have written for you that would have been so elegant.
I know.
I mean, he describes it so beautifully, and he says, "I would never try to, write for his energy because I could never match, but I would write him so it would be so elegant and so sweet and so soft." And so I want to hear that song.
Well, if we draw, I'll have to ask Reggie where it is.
Peter, Elvis, may I interject for a moment?
Well, you look at your hair; it sounds fantastic.
I know, it's that time of night, right? Speaking of the time of night, we're running very dangerously short on time. It's awesome how you guys can have just this really fascinating conversation, and I feel like everyone watching at home has appreciated that. I was wondering though, could we spare just a few minutes for an audience?
Sort of moderate
Yeah.
here.
Could you repeat that, Elvis?
Questions going to appear? Are they going to be in the chat or in the Q&A?
I have direct messaged you all of the questions.
Okay, where did you do that?
In the chat function.
Chat.
If it's easier, I can just ask the questions.
Maybe it will be, because by the time I've read them, it's going to slow us down, and they're really for Peter.
All right. So let me just select some here. I'm sorry if I mispronounce anyone's name who's watching at home. Forgive me. From Karen Kohler. Peter, the title of your book, Looking to Get Lost, is very evocative to this here singer and writer. Would you please share what led you to this title and theme of getting lost and how it's common to all the book's subjects? Thank you.
Well, I mean, the thing that first suggested it to me, I think, was probably the Chet Baker song and then the Chet Baker documentary, Let's Get Lost. I mean, it's been in my mind for a long time. But the concept, it just seems to me, this is what we all seek to do in any area of our lives. I mean, who wants to carry themselves on their back? And whether it's music or writing, I mean, for me, I know, sitting at the keyboard and, 3, 4 hours a day, if I can get lost for, let's say, for the sake of argument, 10 minutes, those moments when you think of nothing else and you're just completely lost in what you're doing. This to me is the encapsulation of everything that you're looking for. And it's the same, the people that I'm writing about, the musicians and the writers, both, it seems to me that this is what carries them along. I mean, Elvis referred to it to some extent, in terms of Eric Clapton talking about Buddy Guy, and it's the idea that you're no longer just operating consciously, but you're carried away by the sweep of your imagination. And it doesn't happen every moment of the time, but it's what you see when you see a great performance by someone, a performance that may exceed the recorded performance of the same song. It's what somebody like Solomon Burke or Sleepy LaBeef, or, that they could achieve so many nights, or Jerry Lee Lewis, or Howlin' Wolf. So that was really, it's that concept, but it's not limited. I mean, if you play sports, you don't want to be thinking about yourself. You don't want to be thinking, okay, now what I want to do is I've been to hitting school and I put my hands, and I do this and that. You want to be caught up in the moment. And that's what the book is all about.
Can I just focus on one question here, Peter, that has come in? Because in this, the way we got lost in talking about these things, and I apologize, everybody, if I was not quite close enough to this microphone, as some people have commented. I think you can hear me now. But the book does end with these two very beautiful chapters, and they took me so very much by surprise, because the one is an edited version of a commencement speech that you gave to the faculty when it was with reference to your father, and the last is with reference to your grandfather.
Mm-hmm.
And many of the qualities of spirit and generosity and kindness in how we live, really, whether it not party political, but like somebody like Johnny Cash, who was raised on a plot of land that was product of something dangerously socialist like the New Deal, that's just a fact of life. It's part of American history.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody here mentions Camp Alton and says they share your memories of their memory of listening to you talk about rock and roll and blues history. Can you just tell us briefly, because sports comes up as a metaphor a few times in the book, which I think everybody who loves music believes that everybody that writes about music or is a very avid chronicler must never have a life out in a field. Tell us something about that, if we can just take a moment.
Well, I mean, with sports, I mean, I've played sports all my life, and it's just been, for me, it's something that takes me outside of myself. I still play tennis. I mean, one of the great regrets of my life, aside from not doing what Solomon Burke called the book with him, and not having had the opportunity to write a story about Satchel Paige, which I pitched to Jan Wenner back in 1970 or something, is not being able to play baseball anymore. And so I still play lots of tennis at the approved social distance of 78 feet, so that's worked in handily. But no, I mean, the last two chapters, the Next to last is about my father and his father, who were both physicians. And the occasion for sort of first putting it together was graduation at the University of San Francisco Dental School. But I've expanded and extended it. But one of the things that that most impressed itself upon me, and I don't know that I would have known this as a kid, but it was the way that my father and my grandfather operated as physicians, the way that they treated their patients, the way that they considered that the patient was the focus of their attention, not themselves, not their dignity as the doctor or something. And that you have to give people the opportunity, you have to treat them with dignity and respect because they all have a story to tell. In this case, they had their illness to talk about. The last chapter is about my other grandfather, Phil Marson, who started Camp Alton, which I ran for 22 years after he got sick. And ran it only to begin with only because of my closeness to him, my deep love for him. But he was the kind of guy, he was so passionate about literature. He was an English teacher. He taught at Boston Latin for many years. But he was so passionate about literature, and he was such a fan of me too. I mean, it was just a wonderful thing to have somebody who just approves of everything you do. But his enthusiasm, and just for all kinds of things. We'd be walking down the street, and he would say, "Hey, Pete, look at that over there." And it would be I would be intensely embarrassed. But he was just so caught up in all aspects of humanity, and it was just inspiring. Probably he was as much the inspiration for my writing, although my father gave great support to my writing. I mean, admired it. Was everybody read, and he was as dedicated to literature in a way as. But my grandfather was, and at one point he was so caught up, and he just always would have these ideas when Vietnam was threatening, when it looked like I might be drafted. He was about to buy land in Canada so we could all live on a commune. This was when he was about 75 or so. But he, at one point, he read Robert Gover's $100 Misunderstanding, which is sort of a dual dialogue between a prostitute and her young client. It's in alternating chapters. And so he got the idea that he and I could write a novel along the same lines, but it would be about the generation gap. And I would be and again, it was the kind of thing I was so devoted to him. And enthusiastic. I don't want to say it wasn't a passive devotion. I said, sure, let's do it. And I was just hoping like hell we were never going to get around to it, because I just said, how is this ever going to work? But that was the kind of thing.
You describe that he tried to convince you of the necessity of reading, I think, a 3-volume Norwegian fable. Is that correct?
Well, he felt that the greatest novel ever written was Sigrid Undset's Crystal Daughter, which has recently been retranslated and is even better. And I did read it when I was about 15, and I shared his opinion, or I thought I shared. I mean, I can't. Again, self-consciousness.
You began writing. You say you did begin writing in response to having this literature put in your way, but you also said that he had a good ear for a dirty joke. He said he could have both. He had appreciation of the high and the low culture.
No, he didn't.
Do you remember any good ones? That this is it. No, I mean, it's a lovely thing, because I makes me wonder that quite a few of the people that you have written portraits of in these essays, there is like in Solomon, there's a grandmother who is incredibly important, believed in him beyond all. It is a very extraordinary, it's a different responsibility, the grandparent to the parent. Obviously, they get to give the children back. You also logically look to the grandparent for some greater fount of experience, if not wisdom. And it is repeated. And there's also throughout the book, there are people like Tammy Wynette, who had tremendously difficult experience as a young woman, just to be able to get to where she wanted to be. Assumptions be made, somebody coming through the door, stand over here, sing this, do this. And somebody who, always has to be somebody who can hold that door open long enough for the person to be able to say their piece, you know.
Yeah, no, and she was just dedicated to her grandparents, to her grandfather in particular. But one of the extraordinary things to me about meeting Tammy Wynette, which was that this woman was such a celebrity and so well known for sort of such iconic songs like "Stand by Your Man." I mean, it was just, but her her the way in which she told her story offered such an intimate view of her life and such a conflicted view of her life, I thought, without going overboard about it. And so again, for me, it was sort of an extraordinary sharing in something which I just felt it was not anything that I anticipated or expected, and yet it was something that she delivered.
We're coming in a few minutes to the end, but there's a question here which takes us in some ways back to my beginning of your writing, in that it brings us back to Charlie Rich. Somebody has asked what your memories are of pictures and paintings and your involvement in that.
Well, that was just such an amazing experience, because I got the idea for doing the album that became Pictures and Paintings probably 5 or 6 years before Joe McEwen got in a position to put together a budget to put it out, to record it for Sire. But prior to that, I had put together a demo tape, which included rehearsal, songs from rehearsal sessions that Charlie did every week out behind his house, in this little studio out behind his house that used to be a projection room. And they're so extraordinary. Then there was, when he won the Memphis Music Award in 81, I think, or 82, he sang "You Don't Know Me." I'd never heard him sing it before. It became really his, the song that defined him. And it was just so heartbreaking. So I put together this little demo tape of 10 or 11 songs. I mean, some weird songs, some straight ahead, a lot of standards from the rehearsal sessions, like "I Can't Get Started," or and I put this, and
One of my very favorite songs. Yeah.
and I sent it around. And for instance, I pitched it to Jerry Wexler, and he said, "I'd really like to do it, but no, man, we can't do it." And so when we finally got to do it, and I brought Scott Billington, who just did such a great job. I brought him in, and Joe bought the concept, and Joe was there. And it was such, I mean, to me, it was like, when he got some of the songs, I mean, I don't want to say I was weeping in the studio, because, it'll sound phony, but it was just, I was just overcome with emotion, because we had traveled. And believe me, it wasn't an easy session, because Charlie would not show up one night. He would break his foot the next night. He had every dodge to get away from doing it, because he was so agoraphobic, for one thing. And he just, but man, it was just an amazing experience. And
Really was. He's that person that lives at that place between the worlds. I mean, he liked Kenton, didn't he? He liked Stan Kenton. He had country. He'd worked. One of the reasons I wanted to work with Billy Sherrill really was not because he was George Jones' producer, but because he was Charlie Rich's producer. Because I felt, well, he understands, and I didn't know as much about Billy Sherrill as I do now from reading where he appears in the stories that you have told. I think I might have got along with him a lot better when we worked together. If I'd known so much about his background in R&B, I would have.
Yeah, but I don't know about that, because really, in his work,
he was a tough guy, that's for sure.
Work with Charlie, I mean, to some extent, it was a competition between him and Charlie was a relatively passive guy in that competition. And it was a struggle for dominance, and I'd say Billy won. And what Charlie achieved with that success was something that gave him very little satisfaction. But Billy was a genius. Billy was amazing. Yeah. And talking to him about Sam Phillips, which was really the only time I had an extent, it was just for the Sam Phillips biography. It's just amazing the way he spoke about Sam and learning his craft from Sam Phillips.
Well, these people that we could talk literally all night, as we have done with Jack Clement, as somebody that we haven't spoken about. Johnny Cash only gets mentioned, and there's an extraordinary chapter about Johnny Cash. One of the things that I would encourage people to read this book is that as with all your books, Peter, and the biographies give us the world that these people come from. These distilled essays give us a sense of knowing the people. We can, it's, you know, reading your Skip James essay from Feel Like Going Home, or the book that I showed to you just before we went on the air, so to speak, the Guide to the Blues. Somebody has to make note of those things in the world of where record shops are not as numerous as they once were. The chance encounter with records and then reading the back of a jacket and that leading you to the curiosity to hear some other records. I have to thank you for all of this, for the feeling of these people that are the greatest artists that America has given in these forms, and people like Muddy Waters, who has a band every bit as disciplined and organized in its peculiar logic as any Duke Ellington orchestra. They just have a perfect role. Anybody that tries to play that music crudely will find out how far from the model. That's what Eric Clapton says very eloquently in your interview.
Yeah.
But it's been such a pleasure. We have one question which inevitably leads us to Elvis Presley, because you wrote these extraordinary books about who is that guy? And it is a question which people get. Now, you may not summon this up, but we are both asked, what is our favorite song by the King? Do you have one that you would name? Just,
You know, I would say, I mean, I'll say right now at this moment, but not necessarily in 5 minutes, my favorite song would be the version of Trying to Get to You that he would have done following the last take he did in the last session that he did at Sam Phillips' son's studio, because he was so committed to that song. He sang it right up till the end of his life. It has sort of such a spiritual arc without being in any way spiritual. And the highs of it are so challenge him, not just vocally, but emotionally, to reach for this, level of communication that, so, I mean, give up Mystery Train, I wouldn't do that. I mean, give up lots of things. Give up the Doc Pomus song that he recorded for Viva Las Vegas, which is just an amazing song. But I'll go with Trying to Get to You. How about you?
well, I had a very curious experience a couple of years ago. I was on a British chat show with a young man, a comedian who could peel bananas with his feet. It was on one of those chat shows where there's several guests. An English soap opera actor who swore so much I felt certain that his interview would never get to air, but they had to use the editing, and Priscilla Presley. And the reason Priscilla was there was because they were releasing one of these albums of Elvis's recordings with the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra.
Right.
They also had an exhibition with his J200, and somebody brought it out like it was a Ming vase with white gloves and handed it to me and said, "Now sing a song for Priscilla." I mean, you can appreciate this is very strange for me, given my stage name, you know. And I sang the song that I won't, in this moment, just as you say, in this moment, I've got to give you this one. Don't. The Costello song, Don't. And I sang it directly to her as best as I could without, spooking myself. It was quite a surreal moment. But as you say, would I trade Mystery Train? Of course. Suspicious Minds, one of the great, where you realize the greatness. And one that I go back to time and time again is If I Could Dream, at the end of the comeback special, just because it's one of the most out of control vocals that was ever really, one where he's clearly straining at the edge of what he can do, because it seems to mean so much. And more, when you think of all the qualities that we love about Solomon, that I loved about Alan Toussaint in a very, with his grace and restraint, when you listen to what he's actually saying in Freedom for the Stallion, these qualities of wanting something better and listening to somebody else, and as somebody who's spent their life, kind of learning the value of silence, and still not really learning that lesson properly. I'm very grateful for all these artists who really, even the exuberant ones like Jerry Lee, with all his contradictions. It's just a wonderful thing to know that this music is there for us any time. And aren't we fortunate to live in the age of all these people, or just beyond it, in the age of the recorded sound, where we can hear them whenever we need them, you know, and see them sometimes as well.
Yeah.
I guess we are almost out of time, but Peter, until I see you again, I want to thank the people from Strand. I mean, these are very difficult times. This is Strand is in my neighborhood in New York when I'm able to live there. Right now, I can't enter the country for, you know, because of the passport I hold. And you know that this is not an easy time for any businesses. I also will acknowledge, to be completely truthful, that I know there are some conflicting views of the things that are going on. But you have to understand, every business that provides work and provides a resource, particularly like books, literature, music, this is as difficult to balance as keeping the factory open, keep the shop open that provides your food. And without the arts, we will be a lot poorer. If we, it's just as important that, so there's a lot of money hidden somewhere. We all know that to be true. And when we emerge from this crisis, there'll be some accounting to be done as to what we truly need to keep going. And I wish Strand all the best and thank them for this opportunity to talk with you in front of a load of people, our friends. Some of your family I know are with us, and some of our close friends are also tuning in. So, Peter, thank you for everything that you've written, and thank you for the time you spent. And you know, we had such a beautiful night in Boston a few years ago when you the shoe was on the other foot, so to speak, at the time. I hope
You had your book.
yeah. Until the next book, Peter.
No, listen, thanks so much. I've really enjoyed it. And thanks to the Strand, of course. And yes, we need to support the arts. We need to support so many things. We need to turn so many things around. And I can only hope. I, I don't know about conviction or belief, but I just can only hope that we will all emerge on the other side in a better fashion.
Yeah, of course we must. We must love one another. And, you know, it really is odd to say, and it's not said in some simplistic greeting card way, but we must be together, you know.
Mhm.
Thank you very much, everybody. And we'll say goodnight and until the next time.